The day of my grandfather's funeral was supposed to be quiet. Not peaceful exactly, grief doesn't really allow that, but contained, controlled. The kind of solemn where everyone speaks softly, where even footsteps seem hesitant, like they don't want to disturb the air too much. The chapel was small, old and familiar. Wooden pews polished smooth by decades of hands, stained glass that filtered the afternoon light into muted blues and golds. The smell of flowers, too many lilies, sharp and sweet at the same time, hung in the air. My grandfather, Chester Thornfield, deserved that kind of goodbye. He was a Vietnam veteran, a farmer, a man who believed in doing things quietly and thoroughly. He spent 60 years on his land, and almost as long building trust with the people around him. He didn't like attention. If he were there, he would have been embarrassed by the turnout. Farmers, loggers, veterans, county clerks, old neighbors, people who hadn't seen him in years but still felt they owed him their presence. They came in dusty boots and pressed suits alike, heads bowed, voices low. I stood near the front with my family, hands folded, eyes fixed somewhere just above the closed casket. I remember thinking that the room felt heavy, like the air itself had weight. Every sound was magnified, the clearing of a throat, the creak of a pew, the soft sniffle of someone trying not to cry. This was one of those moments where everyone understands the rules without being told. You don't raise your voice, you don't make demands, you don't turn someone's grief into a stage. That's why the sound of heels clicking against the wooden floor cut through the room like something breaking. At first, I thought it was just someone arriving late, embarrassed, trying to slip in unnoticed. But the footsteps didn't slow. They didn't hesitate. They moved with purpose, sharp and steady, all the way down the aisle. I felt a few heads turn. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Then a voice followed. "Excuse me, I need to see the will." The words didn't register immediately. It took a second for my brain to catch up, like hearing something in a language you know but don't expect. The voice was loud, too loud. It carried, bouncing off the walls, landing in the quiet spaces between people. I turned. She was standing halfway down the aisle, dressed in black, but not funeral black, not subdued, not respectful, the kind of tailored outfit that looked more appropriate for a boardroom than a chapel. Perfect hair, perfect posture, a face set in something that wasn't grief or sympathy, but impatience. I knew who she was. Brandy Hutchwell, HOA president from the new subdivision bordering my grandfather's land. A woman who had moved into the area less than 3 years earlier and somehow managed to insert herself into everything. Meetings, committees, disputes that had nothing to do with her. I'd seen her before, usually with a clipboard or a tight smile, talking about community standards and future development. But seeing her here, at the funeral, felt unreal. There was a pause, the kind where everyone looks at each other, silently asking, "Did that really just happen?" The pastor stopped mid-sentence. My aunt's hand tightened around mine. Somewhere behind me, I heard a quiet, disbelieving laugh that cut off almost immediately. Brandy cleared her throat, clearly irritated by the lack of response. "I'm asking where the will is," she said again, louder this time. "I was told there were irregularities." That word landed hard. Irregularities. As if my grandfather's life, his death, and everything he left behind were a filing error she needed corrected. My first instinct was anger. Hot, immediate, physical. I felt it rise in my chest, felt my jaw tighten. Every part of me wanted to tell her to leave, to say what everyone else in that room was thinking, that this was not the time, not the place, not her business. But I didn't. I don't know if that restraint came from shock or from something my grandfather had drilled into me over the years. He used to say that the loudest person in the room is usually the one trying to distract you from something. He believed in watching first, listening, letting people show you who they are. So I took a breath and met her eyes. There was no embarrassment there, no awareness that she had crossed a line. What I saw instead was expectation, as if she genuinely believed someone would hand her documents right there, between the casket and the front pew. "The will has been handled by our attorney," I said calmly. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Today isn't the day for this." She frowned like a customer being told a store was closed early. "Well, I think it is," she replied. given the circumstances. A murmur spread through the room. People shifted in their seats. Someone whispered my name. The pastor looked unsure whether to intervene. Brandy glanced around, clearly reading the room and deciding she didn't care. "You see, she continued, gesturing vaguely. "This land situation affects a lot of people, and from what I understand, there are questions about whether everything was done legally. So I'm just asking for transparency." Transparency. I looked around at the faces behind her. Men who had helped my grandfather mend fences, women who had brought casseroles when my grandmother died, veterans who had stood beside him at memorials every year. None of them looked confused. None of them looked concerned about legality. They looked offended. This wasn't about transparency. It wasn't even about the will. It was about timing. Brandy had chosen this moment deliberately. A room full of grieving people, emotions raw, attention divided. She was testing boundaries, seeing how much she could get away with when politeness and shock worked in her favor. I felt my anger cool into something sharper. "The will was filed months ago," I said. "Everything was done properly. If you have questions, you can direct them to our lawyer." She smiled then, a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I will," she said. "I just wanted to make sure it actually exists." That's when the room changed. You could feel it. The shift from confusion to understanding. People weren't just offended anymore, they were alert. Because now it was clear that she wasn't just being inappropriate. She was accusing my grandfather of something. Fraud, deception, as if the man lying in that casket had spent his final years plotting instead of farming, mentoring, and quietly preparing his affairs. My uncle stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You need to leave." Brandy looked at him, then back at me, weighing her options. For a brief moment I thought she might push harder, demand paperwork, make a scene that would force someone to call security. Instead, she lifted her hands slightly, palms out, as if she were the reasonable one. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said. "I just want answers. And I'll get them." She turned and walked back up the aisle, heels clicking again, louder now in the silence she'd created. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The doors closed behind her with a dull thud that echoed longer than it should have. For several seconds nobody moved. Then the pastor cleared his throat and gently resumed the service, his voice softer than before. The rhythm returned, but something had been broken, a crack in the moment that couldn't be smoothed over. I stood there staring at the casket, my heart pounding, not from grief anymore but from something else, a growing awareness that this wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't just poor judgment or social ignorance. People like Brandy didn't barge into funerals by accident. As the service went on, my mind replayed her words. "Where's the will? Irregularities. I'll get them." This wasn't curiosity. It was a challenge. When the service ended and people filed out quietly, several stopped to squeeze my shoulder or whisper apologies for what had happened. A few shook their heads, muttering under their breath. One of my grandfather's old friends leaned in and said, "That woman's trouble," like it was a simple statement of fact. I nodded, but my attention was elsewhere, because standing there, in the aftermath of that interruption, I realized something important. Brandy hadn't come to pay respects. She hadn't come out of confusion or misunderstanding. She had come to see how much resistance there would be. And as I watched the doors where she'd exited, I understood with a clarity that settled deep in my gut that she wasn't just rude, she had a plan. After the funeral, people kept asking me the same question, usually in lowered voices, usually with a glance over their shoulder like someone might be listening. "What are you going to do with the land?" It was never asked out of curiosity alone. There was always something else underneath it. Expectation, speculation, sometimes even excitement. 900 acres tends to do that to people, especially people who don't live on land themselves. To them, it's not a home or a history. It's a number, a blank space on a map, potential. To me, it was the place where my grandfather taught me how to read the weather, by the way the wind moved. Rough the trees. Where he showed me which fence posts had been replaced 3 times and which were original. Where every field had a name, even if no one else remembered it anymore. The property wasn't one solid stretch of flat farmland, the way outsiders imagined. It was divided naturally, shaped by decades of use and care. About 400 acres were timberland, dense with mature hardwoods that had been selectively harvested over generations. My grandfather never clear-cut. He believed in taking only what the land could give back. Some of those trees had been marked when I was a kid, not to be cut yet, but someday. Long-term thinking. 50 years ahead, not 5. Another 300 acres were open pasture, rolling fields that shifted with the seasons. Cattle grazed there for years, then hay. In wetter areas, the grass grew thick and dark, fed by underground springs that had never run dry in my lifetime. The fences followed the land, not the other way around, bending and turning where the ground demanded it. If you didn't know the property, you'd think it was inefficient. If you did, you knew it was intentional. The last 200 acres made up the homestead, the house, the barns, the equipment sheds, the pond my grandfather dug himself after coming back from Vietnam, the place where everything converged, where he paid taxes, filed permits, hosted neighbors, and lived his life. From above, from a satellite image or a zoning map, it probably looked like too much land. D for one person. Too empty, too quiet, the kind of space that invites imagination from people who don't understand it. That's why outsiders called it unused. They drove past on the highway and saw trees instead of buildings, fields instead of rooftops, dirt roads instead of asphalt. In their minds, that meant wasted potential, lost revenue, an opportunity waiting to be unlocked by someone smarter, more efficient, more modern. Brandy Hutchwell was one of those people. The HOA she ran governed a subdivision that bordered the southern edge of my grandfather's property. It had gone up fast, rows of identical houses, narrow lots, decorative trees planted in straight lines. The kind of place marketed as country living without any of the inconvenience of actual country life. When the subdivision first went in, my grandfather hadn't objected. He attended the meetings, asked questions, made sure the boundaries were clear. He even helped the developers reroute a drainage ditch so their construction wouldn't flood his lower pasture. He believed in coexistence as long as respect went both ways. But once the houses were built and the HOA formed, things changed. Complaints started trickling in, about smells from livestock, about dust during hay season, about the sound of equipment early in the morning, about wildlife crossing the road from his land into their community, always framed politely, always under the language of concern and safety. But constant, when Brandy became HOA president, those complaints multiplied. Suddenly, my grandfather's land wasn't just neighboring property, it was a liability, a risk, something that needed to be addressed for the sake of property values. She started showing up at county meetings, asking pointed questions about zoning classifications and future land use plans. She talked about green spaces and walkable communities, but always with a tone that suggested inevitability. Progress was coming whether anyone liked it or not. From her perspective, the land must have looked perfect. 900 contiguous acres, mostly undeveloped by modern standards, sitting right next to a growing subdivision. No commercial buildings, no dense housing, just fields and trees owned by an elderly man nearing the end of his life. To someone like Brandy, that wasn't legacy, it was vulnerability. She likely assumed that once my grandfather passed, the land would fracture, heirs would sell off pieces, taxes would rise, maintenance would become too much. The pressure would build until selling became the practical choice. Developers loved situations like that. They didn't need to force anything, they just had to wait. And when she stood up in that chapel and demanded to see the will, I realized she had been waiting for this moment. What she didn't know, what almost no one outside our family knew, was how thoroughly my grandfather had prepared for this exact kind of thinking. Chester Thornfield never trusted appearances. He'd seen too many people lose things because they assumed common sense would protect them. When he came back from Vietnam, he'd watched neighbors get pushed off their land by rising taxes, bad contracts, and people who knew how to exploit loopholes. He learned early that ownership on paper was only the beginning, so he treated his land the way he treated everything else, as something that needed defense. The protection started with how the property was structured. It wasn't broken into random parcels. It was surveyed and recorded in ways that preserved its integrity. Boundaries were clear, easements were documented, access points were controlled. There were no informal agreements, no handshake deals that could be twisted later. Then there were the records, decades of them, every harvest, every improvement, every tax payment, every inspection. My grandfather kept copies of everything, organized in a way only he could fully explain but anyone could verify. He didn't rely on memory or reputation alone. He relied on documentation. To outsiders, the land looked quiet, static, frozen in time. In reality, it was active, managed, protected. The irony was that the very things Brandy and others saw as signs of neglect were actually signs of restraint. The timber wasn't cut because it wasn't ready. The fields weren't developed because they served their purpose as they were. The homestead hadn't been modernized because it didn't need to be. But people like Brandy didn't measure value that way. They measured it in density, in units per acre, in projected returns. Once my grandfather passed, the attention intensified. Letters from the county about reassessments, requests for surveys, questions about access roads, offers that came disguised as neighborly suggestions. Have you thought about selling just this corner? Would you consider a land swap? It might be easier if you didn't have to manage all this alone. Every inquiry treated the land as if it were already in transition, as if its fate was undecided. That's when I understood the real stake of what Brandy was doing. She wasn't just questioning a will, she was trying to create uncertainty. Because uncertainty is the first step in taking something from someone who doesn't know how to fight back. If she could make the land seem contested, risky, or improperly transferred, she could justify intervention, inspections, legal challenges, zoning reviews. From there, the narrative writes itself. The land becomes a problem that needs solving, and she just happens to have the solution. Standing on the property alone one evening, a few weeks after the funeral, I walked the fence line near the subdivision. On the other side, I could see identical backyards. Patio furniture lined up like showrooms, privacy fences installed just far enough apart to meet HOA guidelines. Kids played, dogs barked, life went on. From their side, my land probably looked like a blank wall of trees and fields, something distant and impersonal. From where I stood, I could see the pond reflecting the sky, the pasture stretching out beyond it, the timber rising behind that like a living barrier. I could hear wind moving through the leaves, the same sound it had made when I was a kid. This wasn't vulnerable land. It was patient land. And the mistake Brandy made, the one she would eventually pay for, was assuming that because something wasn't loud, flashy, or visibly defended, it must be unprotected. What she didn't know was how protected this land really was. The first letter arrived less than a month after the funeral. It looked harmless enough. County letterhead, neutral language. A notice informing me that the property would be subject to a routine review following a transfer of ownership. Nothing unusual, nothing accusatory, just procedure. I told myself that was all it was. Then the second letter came, and the third, one from the zoning office, asking for clarification on how certain parcels were being used, one from the environmental department, citing an anonymous complaint about possible runoff issues near the southern boundary, one from the tax assessor, informing me that the property's valuation would be reassessed due to changed circumstances. Individually, none of them mere NT much. Together they formed a pattern. Every interaction was polite. Every phone call was calm. Every official insisted they were simply following protocol. That was the genius of it. There was no single action I could point to and say, this is harassment. There was only volume, frequency, pressure. Brandy never contacted me directly about any of it. She didn't need to. The system was doing the work for her. Inspectors began showing up unannounced. One morning it was a man in a county truck wanting to check fence setbacks. Another afternoon it was a woman with a clipboard walking the edge of the pasture, measuring distance from the creek. Each time they assured me they weren't accusing me of anything. They were just responding to complaints. Anonymous complaints. I knew where they were coming from. The zoning questions were especially telling. requests for documentation on land use that hadn't changed in decades, queries about whether the timberland was being managed commercially or privately, whether any structures on the homestead might be considered non-conforming under updated codes that hadn't applied when my grandfather built them. Every answer required paperwork, old permits, old maps, old receipts, things that existed but not always in the neat digital format modern offices preferred. I spent hours digging through files, making copies, scanning documents, time I should have been spending learning how to run the farm on my own. The lawsuits aim next, small ones at first, civil filings questioning boundary lines that had been established long before the subdivision existed, claims that certain access roads crossed HOA adjacent land, motions requesting surveys, injunctions, temporary halts to potentially disputed activities. Each filing forced a response. Each response cost time and money. None of it was about winning in court. It was about exhaustion. Brandy understood something very well. Most people don't lose their land because they're wrong. They lose it because they get tired. Because defending what's yours becomes a full-time job layered on top of the job you already have. Because the constant sense of being under review wears you down. The tax reassessment hit hardest. The new valuation nearly doubled the annual bill. On paper, it was justified by market pressures and highest and best use analysis, language that assumed the land should be something it had never been, something denser, more profitable, more aligned with the subdivision creeping closer every year. I sat at the kitchen table one evening staring at the number, feeling a tightness in my chest I hadn't felt since the funeral. It wasn't panic exactly. It was the weight of realizing how easily a system could be turned against you if someone knew which levers to pull. Friends started calling, asking if everything was okay. Neighbors asked why county trucks were on the property so often. A few people offered advice, well-meaning but unhelpful. Maybe it's time to sell part of it. You don't want to fight City Hall. Developers have deeper pockets. At night, the land felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful, watchful. I started sleeping with my phone on the nightstand, volume turned up, just in case. Not because I expected anything dramatic, but because the constant intrusion had trained my mind to anticipate the next problem. Brandy remained conspicuously absent. No emails, no calls, no direct confrontation. But her presence was everywhere. I'd see her at county meetings, seated calmly in the audience occasionally, raising her hand to ask questions about land use consistency and neighborhood impact. She spoke the language fluently, concerned citizen, HOA representative, advocate for order. She never mentioned my name. She didn't have to. What made it worse was how alone it felt. On paper, I was being treated like any other property owner. No one yelled, no one threatened, no one broke any rules, which meant there was no obvious villain to point at, no dramatic injustice that demanded immediate intervention, just procedure. But procedure, applied relentlessly, becomes a weapon. Some mornings I woke up already tired, my mind running through lists of documents I needed to find, calls I needed to return, deadlines I couldn't miss. One missed response could be framed as non-compliance. One delayed inspection could become a citation. That's when I understood why my grandfather had been so meticulous. He used to say that land doesn't protect itself, people protect it, or they lose it. I went back into his old office one afternoon, the small room off the main house where he'd kept his files. It smelled like paper and dust and old wood. The desk was exactly as he'd left it, drawers labeled in his handwriting. Folders stacked with an order that only made sense once you spent time with it. I realized then that reacting to each new issue as it came wasn't enough. That was what Brandy wanted. For me to stay off balance, always responding, always on defense. The stress didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became focused. Instead of dreading the next letter, I expected it. Instead of scrambling to respond, I prepared. I created my own system, a log of every inspection, every complaint, every filing, dates, names, reference numbers, patterns. I stopped answering questions casually. Everything went through email. Everything was confirmed in writing. If an inspector came by, I asked for their badge number and the complaint reference before they set foot on the property. Some of them seemed surprised. A few looked relieved, like they were glad someone else was taking this seriously. The lawsuits kept coming, but they stopped feeling random. I could see how they lined up with zoning inquiries, how tax questions followed inspection reports, how each action created justification for the next. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy, and the more I documented, the clearer it became that the same names appeared again and again, the same concerns, the same phrasing, always anonymous, always procedural. One evening, after filing yet another response, I closed my laptop and sat back in the chair, staring out the window at the dark outline of the pasture. The land was still there, unmoved, patient. I felt tired, yes, frustrated, absolutely, but not defeated, because something had shifted. I wasn't just enduring it anymore. I was understanding it. And that was the moment everything began to change. That's when I stopped reacting and started documenting. What surprised me most wasn't how aggressive the pressure became, but how quietly the response formed around me. It didn't start with speeches or meetings or declarations of support. There were no signs in yards or petitions passed around. It started the way things usually do in a small town, with small, almost forgettable moments that only meant something if you paid attention. The first was Dolores at the diner. The place sat at the edge of the highway, halfway between the subdivision and the older part of town. My grandfather ate there every Thursday morning for as long as anyone could remember. Same booth, same coffee, same nod to the waitress instead of a menu. After he passed, I hadn't gone back much. It felt strange without him. One morning, after an inspection that dragged on longer than it should have, I stopped in out of habit more than hunger. Dolores looked up from behind the counter. ND didn't say anything at first. She just poured coffee and slid the mug across like she always had. "She's been in here a lot," she said eventually, wiping the counter with a rag that didn't need it. "I didn't have to ask who. She talks loud," Dolores continued, "likes to be heard, asks questions like she's collecting something." "What kind of questions?" I asked. Dolores shrugged. "Who owns what? Who's selling? Who's behind on taxes?" She doesn't listen much when people answer. Just nods and writes. That was all she said. No judgment, no advice, just information. But it stayed with me. Then there was Buck at the hardware store. Buck had known my grandfather since before Vietnam. They'd served together, lost touch, then somehow ended up back in the same county decades later. Buck ran the only hardware store within 20 miles, the kind of place where the aisles are narrow and the shelves are stacked with things you didn't know you needed until you saw them. I was picking up fencing staples when Buck leaned over the counter and lowered his voice. "People been asking about your fence line," he said. "Who?" I asked. "Contractors," he replied. "Survey types. Measuring wheels. Asking what kind of posts you use, how deep they go. Not buying anything, just asking." I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, but Buck wasn't done. "I told them I don't know," he added. "Which is true. I don't know anything I didn't learn fixing fences with your granddad." He looked at me for a moment, then smiled slightly, and even if I did, I wouldn't be sharing it. It wasn't a promise. It didn't need to be. It was a statement of fact. Mrs. Patterson at the library came next. She was small, quiet, and had worked there long enough to know not just what books people checked out, but why. One afternoon, she called me and asked if I had a moment to stop by. When I arrived, she didn't pull me into a back room or lower her voice dramatically. She just slid a piece of paper across the desk. "It's public," she said. "I'm allowed to tell you this." The paper listed a series of requests for records, zoning histories, land use precedents, environmental impact reports, all filed under the same name, Brandy Hutchwell. "She's been very interested in your property," Mrs. Patterson added. "More interested than most people are in things that don't belong to them." I thanked her and left, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, relief, not because the pressure was gone, but because I wasn't imagining it. Other people saw it too. The community didn't announce its support, it demonstrated it. Neighbors started waving again, the way they used to before county trucks became a regular sight. A farmer down the road mentioned casually that he'd been asked whether he'd consider selling his land if development came through. He'd laughed and said no, then made sure I knew about it. The editor of the local paper, Marcus Webb, stopped me outside the post office. One afternoon, he didn't mention Brandy right away. He asked how I was holding up, asked about the land, asked about my grandfather. "I've been getting tips," he said finally. "Nothing publishable yet, but enough to know something's off." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. He just wanted me to know he was paying attention. That distinction mattered. Brandy had money behind her, influence, access to consultants and attorneys and people who spoke in polished sentences about growth and opportunity. She moved through official channels easily, confident that credentials and confidence would carry her through. But she didn't have history. My grandfather had helped re-roof half the barns in the county at one time or another. He'd lent equipment without asking for anything in return. He'd shown up when floods hit and fences washed out. He'd argued at meetings, sure, but always in a way that made it clear he cared about the place, not just his piece of it. That kind of trust doesn't show up on a balance sheet. It lives in people. What struck me was how careful everyone was. No one confronted Brandy directly. No one challenged her publicly. They simply observed, noted, remembered. Information moved slowly, but it moved. Someone would mention seeing unfamiliar cars parked near the boundary. Someone else would note which county officials seemed to show up more often than others. Dates, times, names. Nothing dramatic, just facts shared quietly. I started carrying a small notebook again, the way my grandfather used to, not to write down my own thoughts, but to record what others shared, where it came from, when it was said. I didn't push for more. I let people speak at their own pace. The difference between new money influence and earned trust became clearer every day. Brandy could request records and file complaints, but she didn't know which creek flooded first after heavy rain. She didn't know which fields stayed dry when others didn't. She didn't know which fences were original and which were replaced after storms. She didn't know the stories attached to the land. The community did, and they knew when someone was trying to rewrite those stories for their own benefit. One evening, as I drove home along the gravel road leading to the homestead, I noticed a truck pulled over near the fence line. A man stood there, phone in hand, taking pictures. He didn't see me at first. When he did, he nodded and left without explanation. The next morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, I got a call from a neighbor. "Saw someone poking around your south fence last night," he said. "Didn't look like county." I thanked him and hung up, staring out the window at the land stretching out in front of me. It felt less lonely than it had before. Not because I had an army, but because I had witnesses. Brandy's power depended on operating just below the surface, where actions could be explained away as routine. What she didn't account for was a town full of people who noticed patterns, who remembered context, who understood the difference between concern and intrusion. By the time she realized people were watching her, it would be too late. I didn't know yet how all the pieces would fit together. I didn't know which detail would matter most or when the pressure would peak, but I could feel it happening. Information was accumulating, quietly, patiently, and for the first time since the funeral, I wasn't standing alone. Up until that point, everything Brandy had done could be explained away as procedure. Aggressive, yes. Unusual, definitely, but still wrapped in enough formality that any single action looked defensible on its own. That was what made her confident. She believed she was invisible behind the system, protected by rules and titles, and the assumption that no one would ever connect the dots. That belief is what made her careless. It started with an email, not to me, but about me. A clerk in the county planning office forwarded it accidentally, realizing only after the fact that I had been included in the reply chain. The message wasn't overtly threatening. It didn't need to be. It laid out a sequence of next steps regarding my property as if the outcome were already decided. Rezoning considerations, environmental reviews, access studies, all framed as hypothetical, all written in the language of inevitability. The tone wasn't cautious, it was confident, presumptive. What caught my attention wasn't just what she said, but how he said it. She referred to the land as eventually available. She spoke about post-transfer compliance issues, as though the transfer itself were in question despite the will having been filed and validated. She mentioned timelines that aligned suspiciously well with adverse possession thresholds and development planning cycles. She was no longer testing the system. She was using it. I didn't respond. I didn't correct her assumptions or challenge her language. I saved the email, logged the date and time, and added it to the growing file. Then she called. Her voice was smooth, almost friendly. Too friendly. She spoke as though we were collaborators stuck on opposite sides of an inconvenience. I just wanted to clear the air, she said. There's been a lot of back and forth, and I think we can streamline things if we're honest with each other. I told her I was listening. She talked for nearly 20 minutes without interruption, about growth, about responsibility, about how land like mine rarely stayed in one family for long, about how stress could be reduced if I were willing to be flexible. She framed her suggestions as concern for me, for my workload, for my finances, for my future. She never once asked what I wanted. At one point she said something that made my pen pause over the paper. Realistically, she said, if the land ends up tied up in compliance disputes long enough, the county will have to step in anyway. That's not a threat. It's just how these things go. It was the first time she'd acknowledged the pressure openly. The first time she'd suggested that continued resistance would bring consequences. I thanked her for her time and ended the call. She called again a week later, this time leaving a voicemail when I didn't answer. In it, she referenced our previous conversation and repeated several of the same assumptions. She sounded more impatient, less careful. I saved that too. At the next county meeting, she pushed harder than before. Instead of sitting quietly in the audience, she spoke during public comment. She described my property in detail, emphasizing lack of active use and community impact. She suggested that prolonged uncertainty created risks that the county had an obligation to address. She spoke confidently, as though everyone shared her understanding of the situation. But this time, people were listening differently. Marcus Webb sat in the back, notebook open, pen moving steadily. A few county officials shifted in their seats. One glanced down at his paperwork when she mentioned timelines that didn't match anything officially on record. She was building her case in public now, assuming no one would challenge her narrative. That was her mistake, because the more she talked, the more she revealed. She began emailing more frequently, copying more people. She referenced conversations that hadn't happened, inspections that hadn't concluded, outcomes that hadn't been decided. Each message reinforced the same idea, that the land's future was a foregone conclusion, and she was simply helping guide it along. From her perspective, this probably felt like momentum. From mine, it looked like evidence. The clearest example came during a recorded zoning workshop, where she addressed a panel and answered questions from the floor. When asked whether any private agreements existed between the HOA and developers, she hesitated, just long enough to be noticeable, before saying no. Then she added, "At least nothing formal yet." That qualifier hung in the air. The meeting was recorded, archived, and publicly accessible. I didn't confront her afterward. I didn't ask for clarification. I let it stand. People who are overconfident often assume silence means agreement. Brandy mistook my restraint for weakness. She mistook the community's politeness for ignorance. Behind the scenes, the pressure continued, but it became sloppier. Inspection requests overlapped. Complaints contradicted each other. One department referenced findings another hadn't made. It was as if the machinery she'd set in motion was moving too fast for its own cover story. That's when Jake Morrison entered the picture, a former federal investigator recommended by someone who'd known my grandfather well. Jake didn't promise miracles. He didn't dramatize. He just asked for access to everything I'd collected so far. Emails, voicemails, meeting recordings, logs. He studied them quietly, then nodded. "She's not hiding anymore," he said. "She thinks she's past that phase." Jake didn't rush. He followed the paper trail outward, not inward. Development entities tied loosely to the HOA, shell companies with overlapping officers, promises made to investors contingent on land that wasn't owned, rezoned, or even legally available. Brandy's confidence had led her to speak, as if ownership were inevitable. Investors had taken that confidence at face value. That's a dangerous thing to put in writing. The final mistake came when she tried to force a settlement. She requested a meeting, insisting it would benefit everyone to resolve matters privately. I agreed, on the condition that my attorney be present. She arrived with a folder and a smile, speaking quickly, laying out options that all seemed to lead in the same direction: partial sale, easement exchange, temporary access agreements that were anything but temporary. At one point she said, "If this drags on, you'll spend more defending it than it's worth." My attorney asked her to clarify what she meant. She did. She explained how prolonged disputes tended to go, how costs accumulated, how outcomes could shift. She spoke from experience, not theory. The room was quiet when she finished. My attorney thanked her for her candor and asked if she'd be willing to put those assumptions in writing as part of a formal proposal. She hesitated, then agreed. That document became the clearest evidence of all, because in it she outlaid Ned actions that had not yet occurred as though they were guaranteed. She referenced future rezoning approvals that hadn't been requested. She implied coordination with officials who hadn't publicly taken positions. She signed it. By the time she realized what she'd done, it was already too late. The narrative she'd built, that she was merely responding to circumstances, collapsed under the weight of her own words. The difference between advocacy and orchestration became impossible to ignore. I watched the shift happen slowly, then all at once. Emails stopped being answered. Meetings were postponed. Officials who had once been eager to engage suddenly insisted on formal channels. Marcus Webb called to say he was ready to publish. Brandy didn't disappear. She doubled down. She sent more messages, tried to reframe statements, claimed misunderstandings. But confidence, once cracked, doesn't recover cleanly. She thought she was winning. She wasn't even close. By the time Brandy realized the ground under her feet wasn't as solid as she'd assumed, she was already scrambling. Her emails grew shorter, sharper. Her tone shifted from confident to defensive. But none of that mattered anymore, because the fight had moved past pressure and perception. It had moved into something far more dangerous for her. It had moved into the record. The document that ended everything didn't come from a courtroom filing or a county office. It didn't arrive with official letterhead or a process server. It came from a place Brandy never bothered to look. A fireproof safe in the back of my grandfather's office. I found it while sorting through his papers late one night, long after the house had gone quiet. I wasn't searching for anything in particular. At that point I was just trying to understand how thoroughly he'd prepared. The man saved everything. Old tax receipts, handwritten notes, correspondence going back decades, some of it mundane, some of it meticulous. The safe was heavy, scratched and clearly old, the kind of thing you buy once and never replace. Inside were documents I already expected, original deeds, surveys, military records. And then there was a thin folder, yellowed with age, labeled in careful block letters. Agricultural Covenant, 1962. I remember staring at it for a long moment before opening it, not because I didn't know what it was, but because I didn't know how important it was about to become. The covenant was dated more than 30 years before the subdivision even existed. It had been executed shortly after my grandfather returned from Vietnam, when the land was still considered remote and undesirable by most standards. Back then, zoning laws were looser, and landowners had more freedom to bind their property to long-term conditions. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a gentleman's agreement. It was a perpetual agricultural covenant, recorded with the county, tied directly to the deed, and enforceable across generations. In plain terms, it did three things. First, it permanently restricted the land to agricultural, conservation, and forestry use. No residential development, no commercial construction, no rezoning petitions allowed by the owner or any successor. Second, It prohibited subdivision of the property beyond a narrowly defined threshold, effectively preventing the land from being broken into saleable parcels. And third, the part that made my breath catch when I read it, it included a reversionary clause. If the covenant were ever violated, or if any attempt were made to circumvent it through legal manipulation, ownership of the land would immediately revert to the state for conservation purposes. Not fined, not litigated, reverted. My grandfather hadn't just locked the door. He'd wired the building so that if anyone tried to force it open, they'd lose everything. I sat there for a long time, rereading the language. It was dense, formal, and unmistakably deliberate. There were no loopholes, no ambiguous phrasing. It had been drafted by a lawyer who understood exactly how development pressure worked and how to neutralize it permanently. Suddenly, everything Brandy had done made sense in a different way. Her obsession with the will, her fixation on transfer legitimacy, her repeated attempts to create a paper trail suggesting misuse or abandonment. She wasn't just trying to acquire the land, she was trying to disarm it. But she never knew the covenant existed, and that ignorance was fatal to her plan. The covenant had been recorded correctly, but it was old enough that it didn't show up in modern summary searches. You had to look deeper. Most people didn't. Developers relied on digital abstracts and surface-level title reports. Brandy had assumed that if it wasn't immediately visible, it wasn't there. Her mistake was thinking preparation only moved forward in time. When I brought the document to my attorney, he didn't speak at first. He read it once, then again. This, he said finally, changes everything. Because the covenant didn't just block future development, it invalidated the very premise of her campaign. All her zoning complaints, all her tax reassessments based on highest and best use, all her investor promises built on rezoning assumptions, they were all legally impossible. Worse, her actions had arguably triggered the reversion clause. By advocating for rezoning, by coordinating development discussions, by attempting to pressure a sale in defiance of the covenant's restrictions, she had done exactly what the document warned against. She hadn't just failed to unlock the land, she'd set off the alarm. The timing couldn't have been worse for her, or better for me. The covenant was introduced at a county hearing she had pushed for herself. She sat 3 rows back, confident, surrounded by binders and consultants. When my attorney stood and referenced a recorded agricultural covenant predating all modern zoning overlays, I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross her face. When the document was entered into the record, that uncertainty turned into something else, confusion. The county officials hadn't known about it either. They leaned forward, whispering to one another, flipping pages, checking references. Someone asked for the recording number. Another requested a recess to verify the filing. Brandy stayed silent. For the first time since this began, she had nothing to say. The verification didn't take long. The covenant was real, properly recorded, still enforceable, still binding. The room changed. Questions shifted away from my compliance and toward her conduct. Why had development discussions been initiated at all? Why were rezoning time? Lines discussed for land that could not be rezoned. Why were complaints filed suggesting misuse when the covenant explicitly limited allowable uses? Each question tightened the net. And then the reversion clause came up. The county attorney explained carefully that if it were determined that there had been a coordinated effort to violate or undermine the covenant, the state could assert its claim immediately. That didn't just threaten Brandy's plans. It threatened her investors. The same confidence that had carried her through months of pressure drained out of her in real time. She started whispering urgently to the people beside her. Papers shuffled. Phones came out. Her own actions, the emails, the statements, the settlement proposal, were suddenly being viewed through a different lens. Not as advocacy, but as evidence of intent to circumvent a legally protected restriction. Intent mattered, and she documented plenty of it herself. The irony was almost unbearable. If she had done nothing, if she had simply waited quietly for decades, nothing would have happened. The land would have remained agricultural, protected, out of reach but stable. Instead, she pushed, she pressured, she escalated, and in doing so, she exposed herself to the one mechanism designed to stop exactly what she was attempting. The covenant didn't just protect the land from her, it punished attempts to exploit it. By the end of the hearing, the conversation had completely reversed. I wasn't being questioned anymore. I was being thanked for bringing clarity, for preventing costly legal entanglements, for exposing risks the county hadn't fully understood. Brandy left early. No speech, no confrontation, just a hurried exit, head down, phone pressed to her ear. The document she never knew existed had rendered every move she made meaningless. Worse than meaningless, dangerous. She hadn't been fighting me. She'd been fighting a decision made in 1962 by a man who understood patience, foresight, and the long game better than she ever could. And by forcing the issue, by refusing to accept quiet boundaries, she had triggered the very outcome she feared most. The land wasn't going to be developed. It wasn't going to be sold. And if she pushed any further, it wouldn't belong to anyone involved in her scheme at all. That was the moment the fight ended, even if she didn't realize it yet. The collapse didn't happen all at once. There was no single dramatic announcement, no moment where everything suddenly went silent. It happened the way consequences usually do, methodically, one piece at a time, as reality caught up to assumptions that had gone unchallenged for too long. In the weeks after the covenant was entered into the record, the tone of every interaction changed. County inquiries that had once focused on my compliance shifted to internal reviews. Meetings were postponed, then rescheduled with different agendas. Emails that once arrived daily slowed, then stopped altogether. When inspectors did come out, they were formal, careful, and brief. The sense of urgency that had surrounded my property evaporated. Brandy, on the other hand, grew louder before she disappeared. She challenged the covenant publicly at first, insisting it had been misinterpreted, outdated, or improperly applied. But each challenge required scrutiny, and scrutiny required records. The deeper officials looked, the worse it became for her. Not because of the covenant alone, but because of everything she'd built on top of ignoring it. The promises she'd made, to investors, to partners, to people who had bought into the vision she'd sold, were suddenly impossible to fulfill. Development plans based on rezoning that could never occur. Projections built on land that could never be subdivided. Timelines that assumed ownership she never had and never would. Once that reality became unavoidable, the questions turned inward. Investigations followed, quiet at first, then formal. Emails were subpoenaed, meeting recordings reviewed, financial arrangements examined under a lens that no longer assumed good faith. The same paper trail she'd created to apply pressure now told a different story. She hadn't just been wrong, she had been reckless. The HOA distanced itself. Quickly, public statements emphasized that she had acted independently, beyond her authority. Board members resigned, then were replaced. Policies were revised. The subdivision that had once been her base of influence became careful, subdued, eager to demonstrate cooperation. Brandy was removed from her position before she could resign. The investors moved next. Some demanded refunds. Others filed complaints. A few tried to claim they'd been misled, unaware that ignorance offered little protection when money changed hands, based on assumptions that should have been verified. The legal outcomes weren't dramatic, but they were final. Charges were filed where they were warranted, settlements were reached where they made sense, licenses were revoked, restrictions were imposed. Brandy's name stopped appearing on meeting agendas and filings, replaced by phrases like former president and subject of review. She lost credibility first, then influence, then everything that had depended on both. I didn't celebrate any of it. There was no satisfaction in watching someone dismantle their own future. Only a sense of inevitability. When you build on something that isn't real, collapse isn't a possibility, it's a certainty. The land, meanwhile, settled back into itself. With the pressure gone, the county moved to formalize what had already been true for decades. Conservation status was reaffirmed. Agricultural exemptions were clarified. The tax assessment was corrected, not as a favor, but as an acknowledgement that the highest and best use argument had never applied. The subdivision adjusted, complaints stopped, boundaries were respected, the fence line became just a fence line again, not a fault line. Something else happened too, something quieter but more meaningful. People started coming by again, not to ask questions or offer advice, but just to talk. Neighbors stopped at the gate. Farmers checked in during planting season. Veterans who'd known my grandfather came by to walk the land, share stories, remember? The place didn't feel contested anymore. It felt held. In time, discussions began about the future, not development, but preservation, educational use, conservation programs, a veterans' retreat tied to agricultural work and land stewardship. Nothing rushed, nothing imposed, just ideas explored at the same pace my grandfather had always preferred. Slowly, thoughtfully. The land didn't need to be transformed to matter. It already mattered. It just needed to be understood on its own terms. One afternoon, months after everything had settled, I stood by the pond my grandfather dug with his own hands. The water was still, reflecting the trees along its edge. The same trees he'd marked decades ago, planning for a future he knew he wouldn't see. That was when it fully sank in what he'd done. He hadn't just protected the land from development. He'd protected it from urgency, from the pressure to act quickly, to compromise under stress, to trade permanence for convenience. He'd made it impossible for anyone to claim that short-term gain justified long-term loss. He'd trusted that whoever came after him would take the time to understand what he'd left behind. Brandy lost everything because she believed speed was power, because she thought confidence could substitute for diligence, because she assumed that if something wasn't loudly defended, it wasn't defended at all. The community endured because it understood patience, and the land remained because it had been prepared for a future that didn't depend on who shouted the loudest or moved the fastest. Legacy isn't built in moments of confrontation. It's built in years of quiet decisions that don't look impressive until they're tested. My grandfather understood that. In the end, that understanding outlasted everything else.